Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and this week on The War Within Alpha, we got a ton of exciting new updates with plenty of new class changes for us to dive into, as well as a whole new zone of Ashka Head for us to explore with 2 new dungeons for us to delve into. And when we were checking it out over on the live stream the other day, immediately I decided to dive into the newest and the very first hero spec for the enhancement shaman, the Stormbringer. But from there, we also had other class changes for us to explore, with new talent revamps coming for Destro Warlocks, Brewmasters, and even Rogues, my current main class. But before we did some rogue testing, I decided to give Unholy Death Knight changes a go, as the whole class talent tree of the Death Knight, the one that's going to be shared between Blood, Frost, and Unholy, got a massive new revamp, the kind that every Death Knight has been waiting for so long. This is the change the Death Knights have needed all throughout Dragonflight, but it looks like they are finally getting their due diligence in the War Within Alpha. So, in today I wanted to do a much deeper dive into all of the new changes coming to the class talents of Death Knight, but also explore some of the new changes available for Unholy, with more Frost and Blood changes to be announced in the future weeks. So let's dive into Unholy class changes, and be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more class updates on the War Within Alpha. So I first want to go over the class talent changes for Death Knights, and then we'll go over what are some of the changes that are happening to Unholy. Though remember, Frost and Blood are apparently going to receive additional changes over the next few builds, though they'll likely be rolling out slowly over time. Though, for the class talent tree, as well as some of the basic Death Knight things, there's so much good that's being added as of this update. And with the combination of some of the best and some of the most fun hero talents, I think, for me personally, Death Knight is now on my radar as one of my potential main classes going forward, or at least, if anything, alts that I'm definitely going to be leveling as soon as possible in the War Within. So starting off, I'm actually going to do is reset the left hand side talent tree, just because I can go over really quickly about the talent point management. One of the things that I wanted to add into the class talent tree is to give Death Knights more points and a lot more flexibility as to how you allocate these talent points. Now, when you first start building into the talent tree, it's going to start out to feel a little bit like you're missing talent points, but as you build further, it does let you kind of go back and overfill towards the top. So, going over all the new changes, off the bat, you're going to have Unholy starting out with Raise Dead. From there on, we will see changes immediately with Cleaving Strikes. Cleaving Strikes causes the Clawing Shadows for Unholy to hit 7 additional enemies while you remain in Death and Decay, and when leaving Death and Decay for 4 seconds. And this bonus applies for Blood as well as Frost, which makes cleaving with Death and Decay uptime a little bit easier. This isn't the best solution that we really wanted to see out of Death Knights, as you will still be reliant on standing in Death and Decay in order to get maximum value out of your cleave. However, this is at least a good step forward into making this talent a little bit easier to play around. Though talents like Unholy Ground are still going to remain, so you will still have builds, especially as Blood Death Knight, that are going to be very heavily planned around standing inside of Death and Decay as much as possible. But from here on, you see a couple of changes like Icebound Fortitude being a 2-minute cooldown baseline, Veteran of Third War being a 1 talent point that gives you a maximum amount of stamina, a new location for March of Darkness, but also a new choice node now between Enfeeble as well as Sacrificial Pact. One sacrifice your gold to give you more healing, the other causes your gold to debuff the enemy, making them do less damage to you. But pretty early on, you will actually see that I'm kind of limited on the talent points that I can play with, especially if I want to unlock all the other parts of the talent tree pretty early on. So off the bat, things seem a little bit dire, but as you start unlocking points further down so you can unlock more aspects of your talent trees, it actually does get a little bit better. While we're in that same row, we also have a new talent for Ice Prison, which changes Chain of Ice to now root your enemies for 4 seconds, but its cooldown is now increased to 12 seconds. This may be useful in PvE content, especially if you pair it together with Proliferating Chill, just so you can provide a little bit extra control. But for the most part, if you PvP, this will be a less of a favorable talent for you. Pretty early on, we can pick up Icy talents, which have been moved up in a couple of slots, where it now costs 1 singular talent point while giving you full value, increasing melee attack speed by 6% for 10 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. Also, talents such as Unholy Bond will grant you 20% more effectiveness for your Rune Forge of your weapon with only 1 talent point that you can invest into. Further down the road, we have Soul Reaper that can be picked up really early on, so if you're looking to cleave on your Unholy or Frost or Blood Death Knight with Soul Reaper, this talent is going to be much easier for you to get a grasp of. And from there you can grab things like Anti-Magic Zone, Asphyxiate, and then you have a whole other row of some new additions. Unholy Endurance for the most part stays the same. Blood Scent provides you 5% additional leech, and Suppression now causes damage from area effect attacks to be reduced by 3%. When suffering a loss of control effect, this bonus is increased by additional 6% for 6 seconds. So it's 3% plus a 6% bonus, creating a 9% AoE damage reduction, which is basically allows you some free avoidance whenever you're crowd controlled. But as you unlock all of these gates that help you unlock all the capstones, you still have 3 talent points that you can go back and reinvest into your talent points. So if you want to pick up something like Icebound Fortitude, or if you want to even drop Death Strike, if you are mostly a PvE Death Knight, to pick up Brittle, or if you just want to pick up more utility or crowd control, you can go back and do so. There's a little bit of flexibility once you get towards this row down here. Further down, we have things such as Death's Echo, which now costs only 1 talent point, giving you 2 charges of Death's Advance, Death and Decay, and Death Grip. We still have the Will in Necropolis, and Rune Mastery is about the same, and same goes for Insidious Chill. Then further down in the next row, we have a couple of new options like Osmosis, where Anti-Magic Shell will increase all healing that the Death Knight is receiving by 15%, and with 2 points by up to 25%. This is fantastic for Unholy Death Knights, Frost Death Knights, and Blood, as now you can utilize Anti-Magic Shell even if you don't have any magic damage that you need to avoid, to simply amp up your overall healing taken, which works for all healing mechanics, either being healed by another player or if you're going for self-sustain. In the next row that takes you into your Abomination Limb, Subdue and Grasp is going to be the next talent. When you pull an enemy, the damage they deal to you is reduced by 8% for 6 seconds. And as it stands right now, when you use the ability, it works against bosses, even if you can't actually grip them and move them around with the Death Grip ability. This may create an interesting combination where you may end up utilizing Death Grip as a Death Knight as a defensive against certain boss mechanics. Though to some degree this doesn't feel like this is an intentional mechanic because, well, I imagine that would be kind of annoying having to save Death Grips during very specific boss abilities. But it could be also interesting utility for Death Knights to have some kind of extra defense against certain tough encounters. I think it's kind of cool that Death Knights technically can do it, I just don't really know if it's an intended mechanic or anything of that sort. Anyway, continuing on, we have one more talent in the row, which is Runic Protection, a more defensive runic ability where your chance to be critical struck is always 3% no matter how many talent points you put into it. Though, the more talents you put in, it increases your armor either by 3% or by 6% at 2 talent points. Though you will also notice that Death Knights now have access to a couple of more capstone abilities at the bottom row. We have our familiar A-Bomb Limb, which has been changed as it no longer grants you class resources. So things such as Bone Shield, Runic Corruption, or Rhyme procs for Frost Death Knight no longer are granted by A-Bomb Limb, likely to keep it as a utility or a burst ability, but not really something that is necessary as part of your overall rotation. On the left-hand side, we have a new version of Blood Draw, which is very similar to a talent that existed somewhere in the upper points of talent tree, but has been adjusted down below. When you fall below 30% health, it's kind of like a GT death mechanic, you will draw health from nearby foes, though at 3 or 5.2 million health, being able to heal for 32,000 per target is a very low number, so hopefully that'll be adjusted. Though it does have a bonus where now the damage you take when you draw in health is reduced by 10%, and your Death Strike cost is reduced by 10 runic power for 8 seconds. So an 8-second damage reduction as self-heal at a Death Strike spam window, though the cheat death can only occur once every 3 minutes. And on the other side, we have a more magic-themed capstone traits that offers you either self-defense or group utility. The first and the easy option is Null Magic, where Death Knight's magic damage taken is flat out reduced by 10%, which is quite a bit, and the duration of harmful magic effects on you are reduced by 35%. Which is huge. Imagine this on a Blood Death Knight, who is generally pretty good at dealing with magic damage since they have that self-heal and absorbs in order to be able to take in massive amounts of magic damage at a time, which makes him fairly close in rivaling to Vengeance Demon Hunters, who are really good at absorbing magic damage, but now Death Knights even get a 10% magic damage DR and a reduction of magic effects, which makes him even better at dealing with caster's type of damage. For Unholy and Frost, it's also a survivability increase, and in PvP, the duration of magic effects can also be helpful as well. Or on the other side of things, you could be a little bit more party-oriented with Vestigial Shell. Casting Anti-Magic Shell, which I should have also mentioned is, by the way, not a talent anymore, it is a baseline ability that you earn now. Casting Anti-Magic Shell will now grant 2 nearby allies a lesser version of anti-magic shell that absorbs up to a set amount of magic damage, not a lot, and reduces the duration of harmful magic effects on him by 50%. I'm hoping that the actual absorb effect is being increased a little, because 124 magic damage absorbed is not a lot, but you now can utilize anti-magic shell as a party buff similar to what mages can do with Mass Barrier that provides allies a little bit of that magic protection, which is kind of huge because Death Knights now get some party utility, and I think that's a very interesting talent. And the choice nodes that you have now between a bomb limb, a cheat death, or an anti-magic or a party magic buff is now a more of an interesting choice than ever before. Obviously, I'm a big fan of null magic, but now I feel like Death Knights, and this is exactly what they wanted to accomplish with the class talent tree, is to give them choices, especially in the capstones. You'll be able to pick up all the things that give you the most amount of damage and overall performance value, but from there you can kind of pick and choose which talents you want to, whether you want additional mobility, or you want utility, or you want to have more party benefits or movement, or you want to have more of this capstone bonuses from down below. Which I think overall, the talent tree, which may need a couple more adjustments, but this is an upgrade compared to what they've had so far, at least in my opinion, and I really like the direction that they're going with it in general. But also we've had some Death Knight specific mechanics adjusted here as well. If we head over into the zone or into the area of the Arcturus, where you can rune forge your weapons, because even rune forges became a little different. First of all, Rune of Hysteria is completely removed. You now have Razor Rise, Sanguination, Spellwarding, Apocalypse, Fallen Crusader, Stone Skin Gargoyle, which can also work on one-handed weapons for whatever reason, and Rune of Endemic Thirst. But Hysteria is removed because it caused, as the devs say, volatility in the uptime of Breath of Dragosea, though more changes are coming to Breath of Dragosea in the future to make it a little bit more consistent. Another rune that also got updated is the Rune of the Apocalypse, which I've been playing around with recently. This is a different rune compared to Fallen Crusader, which simply buffs your Death Knight and gives you a bit of a heal. Rune of the Apocalypse empowers your ghoul, and every time your ghoul attacks, there's a chance to apply one of the 4 debuffs to the target. Now, I did a few dungeons and even was able to log some of those dungeons as well to see what the uptime of these debuffs was, as well as how much damage they did, to see if it could potentially be competitive. What I found out is War, which is a debuff that causes enemies to take 4% more damage from the Death Knight, 4% that is stacking, of course. That debuff had roughly 48% uptime, and I couldn't really exactly determine if this was at the high end, like 2 stacks, 3 stacks, or if this was mostly in the 1 stack range. But if you could get a better uptime on a pure single target fight, then I imagine the debuff could actually be kind of good. Pestilence is another debuff that does damage over time, and they increase the damage of that disease debuff by 500% in this build. Overall, Pestilence saw a roughly 38% uptime, and it ended up being about 2% of my overall damage in single target encounters. As for the Famine debuff, which reduces the amount of damage the enemy does to the Death Knight, that also saw about a 38% uptime, as well as Death, which reduces target's self-healing, also about a 38% uptime. What makes the Apocalypse debuff a little bit harder to track and harder to figure out if it's going to be good is every time your ghoul attacks, there's a chance to put up one of the 4 buffs on the target. Sometimes it's going to be 2 stacks of War, and then it'll put up Pestilence, and then stack Pestilence, which means the War is going to fall off unless the ghoul can refresh it. And you can do a couple of things like go with Ghoulish Frenzy, which increases the attack speed of you and your monstrosity by 10%, so there may be a little bit more consistency in terms of the amount of debuffs they can put up. But the amount of debuffs and what type of debuffs the ghoul puts on the target and what the debuff itself is changes so drastically, and the only way to really control it is by giving the ghoul a bit more auto attack speed. But because of just how sporadic and random it is in general, I don't really know. I think it just might be better just to play with the Fallen Crusader, though with this new buff to Apocalypse, we'll see if the numbers end up adding up to be of any significance down the line. Now that we got the Death Knight stuff out of the way, I want to go over the Unholy Death Knight changes. And for the most part, at the beginning of the talent tree, you're not going to see too many differences, except with Sudden Doom being moved up a little bit. From there on, we see a bit of a restructure with your talent points being more thematic rather than anything. And let me explain to you exactly what is new, but also how thematically things change. On the left-hand side, you're going to have more of a shadow damage, festering wounds, as well as pestilence and disease type of themes, with foul infections increasing damage of diseases by 10%, and giving them 5% increased chance to critical strike. From there on, we get talents such as Unholy Blight as well as Defile that feeds further into Pestilence and things like Bursting Sores. Bursting Sores can then be upgraded into Vile Contagion to spread your festering wounds everywhere, Ebon Fever to buff your diseases, or even splits off into Ruptured Viscera, where when your ghouls explode or your army of the undead ghouls explode, there's a chance that it'll apply festering wounds on a target. But you can see there's like a thematic shadow damage, disease damage, and mostly a festering wound type of a thing going on here, where the middle row mostly deals when it comes to your pet abilities and pet damage, with things like Apocalypse, things like Infected Claws, and now moved up version of Ghoulish Frenzy, which buffs the attack speed of you and your monstrosity. We have Mages of the Dead with a further upgrade that allows menacing mages. The Mages of the Dead will now cleave with their Shadow Bolts, with a volley of bolts to 4 targets. And on the right hand side, we have a Unholy Pact, which ends up igniting the chain between you and your pet, with a little bit more of a pet-based gameplay with All Will Serve, as well as Eternal Agony buff in the pet, which will lead into another town that's still under construction. But on the right hand side, we have a choice of your Scourge Strikes or Clawing Shadows, and then Reaping with an Execute Sudden Doom, Death Coil buffs, and even more Death Coil buffs. And then it becomes more or less the same talent tree as we remember towards the capstones, but everything is a little bit different, except on the left hand side. This stays the same with Death Rot, into Festermite, and into Unholy Assault. The middle, however, starts out with Army of the Dead, which is now a baseline 3-minute cooldown. In fact, all your other undead type of abilities, such as Dark Transformation, is a 45-second cooldown, but also is Apocalypse 45-second cooldown, and you won't really find any more talents that reduce the cooldown of those abilities. That's just the baseline cooldown. Instead, you'll have things like Eternal Agony that can prolong the duration a little bit, but that's about it. With that being said, Army of the Dead can then be further upgraded with Raise Abomination, which replaces Army of the Dead, turning it into 1.5-minute cooldown where you summon a massive big abomination for 30 seconds instead of an army of ghouls. And the abomination kind of has a mind of its own, but it's fairly consistent with the rest of your pets. Don't worry about the chargers as part of the Rite of the Apocalypse, but the actual A-Bomb is quite a good pet. At all times, it's going to have a disease cloud, which infects nearby enemies with a virulent plague for free. But also, while it attacks, it also applies festering wound to the target when it melees. Besides this, we also have a talent that's still under construction, so we'll see what that ends up being, but also Morbidity, as well as Super Strain functioning exactly as they did before. Though on the right hand side, we now have a choice node between Summon Gargoyle, which summons the same old Gargoyle that's going to gain power as you spend runic power while it's uptime, or Doomed Bidding, which is a new talent where consuming Sudden Doom now calls a Mages of the Dead to assist you for 8 seconds. And for my time playing in the alpha, sudden procs are fairly easy to come by, which means that your pets are going to be getting a lot of value with these mages constantly spawning in left and right. In fact, if you're going for a more pet heavy build as Unholy, mages can actually be a huge portion of your overall output, whether you're doing AoE damage or single target encounters. But I thought the Mages of the Dead was an interesting take compared to Summon Gargoyle, someone that's more passive, someone that can cleave multiple targets, and has no new synergy with a pet-focused build. Though every Death Knight is different, as I've seen Death Knights play into a more disease-focused build, maybe even together with Sunlayan, because you do have Inflection of Sorrow, which plays around your diseases a little bit more. But I think there's a lot of potential for Death Knights to go into a pet-heavy build, disease-heavy build, or maybe Shadow Damage, Death Coil build, or mix and match of both. And I'm very interested to see what these two other talents are going to be in the future, and hopefully they'll help finalize some of the other potential builds that still haven't been unearthed just yet. But with that, that's going to be the entire update for the Unholy Death Knight. And with a little bit of time that I spend with the spec, this one gets me more excited about Blood and Frost going forward. But Unholy has gotten yet another change between its class tree, which I think is a big gain for every single spec of Death Knight, but also the Unholy specific changes. It looks like they're doubling out on what was built up from Dragonflight and are just looking to expand and give you more choices, while also giving you more opportunities to spend talent points and customize your build in exactly everywhere you want to. But with that, that's going to be everything we got so far for the Death Knight. You heard my opinion, but I really want to hear what you guys think about these Death Knight changes down in the comments below. What are your thoughts about the class changes, but also the spec changes for the spec of Unholy? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below. As per usual, if you guys enjoyed this video or found it informative, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. I would very much appreciate it. And as always, in the description of every single video and live stream, we have a link to our Discord community channel. Probably the best place to reach out to me directly in case you want to let me know what you thought about this video or hang out with the rest of the community to discuss some of the upcoming changes. join our Discord to become part of the community. But otherwise, thank you all so much for watching this video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know all of your thoughts down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in another video.